am Jackie Cohen-Roth, founder and CEO of Cannabis MD and sister social enterprise and nonprofit TPAD that you're going to hear about later in the program. Welcome to our webinar today, Hospice and Palliative Care, Medical Cannabis. Is it a complement and an alternative to care? In just a couple of minutes, you're going to be meeting our three panel members that are joining us, Dr. Blake Pearson, Tony, and Dr. Jacqueline Schneider. Cannabis MD is focused on filling the void of cannabis science and policy education. And we're executing our mission by the webinars that we host, like the one that you've joined us today, educational programs that we're focused on educating across the ecosystem of the medical cannabis industry to help remove the stigma and collectively and collaboratively move the industry forward so that we can deliver optimal patient care. Our goal for today is for you to take away something that you'll be able to share with others, something that's going to inspire you, something that's going to educate you, whether you take it into your own cannabinoid-based medicine practice, within your medical cannabis company, as an educator, or for your personal use. We have a couple of housekeeping notes that I wanted to share that, and first we are going to have, and apologize, I'm a little bit distracted, we've got too many technical issues going on at the moment, but in any event, Milan is behind the scenes with Zoom. Milan, are you able to pull up a poll that we have? And if you would share that, if not, we will move on. I wanted to let everybody know that this webinar is being recorded. There's the poll, excellent. So I would love to know more about you. What is your primary focus in the cannabis industry? And if you'd share that, whether you're a cannabis license owner operator, you're involved in cannabis science and researcher, you're an ancillary service provider, a healthcare provider, a medical cannabis patient or consumer, or if you're a member of the hospice and palliative industry, you may be answering all of those. And we'll leave that poll up while I go through some housekeeping notes with you. So Emily Jacobs, Cannabis MD intern extraordinaire, is behind the scenes managing the chat room. She's going to be keeping an eye out for the questions that we're going to do our best to address during the Q&A session that's going to follow the discussion that will last for about 45 minutes. I ask you that you please do not promote your company in the chat. If you'd like to promote your company, the best way to do that would be to partner with Cannabis MD and come on board as one of our sponsors. So again, ask you to be mindful of that and respect each other in the chat. Never had a problem with that yet, but always ask. And let's get the conversation going. So love to bring on Dr. Pearson, if you would come on camera, Tony and Dr. Schneider. And with that, we're going to look at the poll, which looks like the majority of everybody here is cannabis science and research. Oh, no, the majority of healthcare providers are leading, then cannabis science and research, followed up by medical cannabis patient or consumer. So welcome and thank you for joining us. So Milan, if you'll take down that poll and we'll get our program started. Okay. See. All right. And Emily, I'm going to ask you, does everything, and if you would unmute yourself and say hi, and I just want to make sure that the video and audio is working for everybody.
Hi, everyone. So glad to be here.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. Let's see. So bringing on board Dr. Pearson, if you'd unmute yourself, Dr. Schneider and Tony. And I think through the wondrous world of LinkedIn, as I've met Dr. Pearson and Dr. Schneider, Tony was introduced to a mutual colleague of ours in the industry, which I think essentially brings us all together. So Dr. Pearson, you're immediately next to me on my Brady Bunch screen. So if you would share where you are, what you're doing in the medical cannabis space, and welcome.
Thank you. Sure. I'm in Canada, close to Toronto, and I've been practicing cannabinoid medicine for the last about 5 or 6 years. Primary focus was in primary care, general practitioner, And over the last 5-6 years, really focused the practice on using CBD THC in practice for a wide range of conditions, specifically a lot of chronic pain, insomnia, mental health disorders. And as it relates to our conversation today, I see a lot of patients in long-term care, nursing homes, hospice setting, and use cannabinoids in the dementia patients to manage behaviors. And as we'll talk about today, in that hospice setting for palliation, nausea, vomiting, pain, all of those things.
And uniquely that we're going to be hearing uniquely qualified is that you're treating patients both in Canada and the US? Is that correct?
Yeah, so I'm board certified in both Canada and the US. And yeah, I have that lens of treating patients in both countries. And again, using specific doses for the audience. We're really using specific milligrams of THC and CBD, kind of like regular medicine, of course. And also a lens of training a lot of healthcare practitioners, whether it's nurses, docs, pharmacists in Canada, the US, Australia, and the UK as well.
Excellent. All right. Looking forward to hearing more. Dr. Schneider, welcome from Buffalo, New York. Thank you so much for joining. And if you would please share what brought you to cannabis and unique qualifications to join us today.
Absolutely. So yeah, I am in sunny Buffalo. I'm just below Dr. Pearson. If you look on the map, I'm jealous. I do not have the ability to prescribe and dose in milligrams. You know, my practice is a lot different here in New York, but I am a board certified internal medicine physician and also board certified in hospice and palliative care. I used to be the program director of the fellowship, at the University of Buffalo. So I've trained many fellows to actually take their boards. And I started my journey in cannabis in 2018. I started doing medical certifications. I've certified hundreds of patients across New York and really have had a journey through that. My husband's taught me a lot about cannabis just because he's a patient and he's in front of me and that's who I see. So I've really have tried to incorporate cannabis in my life. It's a little difficult because I do work for the VA, and as we all know, it is not federally legal. So it's been a little bit of a challenge, but that's me in a nutshell.
Well, thank you. And yeah, we come from the same part of the world, that sunny, cold part of New York State. Tony, welcome from the other side of the country, coming in from California. So if you would please share what brings you to medical cannabis and your practice focus.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll make everyone jealous. It's freezing here today. It's 64 degrees. So I'm Tony, originally from the East Coast, and my journey in the cannabis has always been a personal one. As my own patient, I'd like to say I was a nurse in clinical bedside in pediatrics and suffered a tremendous professional burnout along with some personal traumas at the time. And I left the bedside realizing that as a nurse, I was unhealthy as many of my colleagues. So I really got into yoga and meditation and bringing ways to help nurses honestly prevent burnout or how to really just survive in the work environment. And I did a lot of work with the American Nurses Association and their Healthy Nurse, Healthy Nation challenge, really just trying to get the message out and incorporating movement and rest and sleep. Along that lines, I was utilizing cannabis as well the whole time. But of course, as we know, we couldn't talk about it. And I got involved in cannabis because of my dad. He was just that guy that wanted to make sure that if I was going to utilize cannabis, it was going to be safe, and he was going to make sure that he knew where it came from. So that was something we shared together, and contributing to this conversation today. And also my reason for being in this space is that my father, unfortunately, has passed from cancer in 2017, and medical cannabis wasn't available for him then. It was not available for my mom, who I believe could have utilized it as a caregiver, you know. So it's really, I came out here to California to learn more and see how I could contribute. And what I noticed immediately was that there is a lack of education in communities, a lack of knowledge, a lack of support for not only medical cannabis, what I see a lot more as states become adult recreational legal, that there's a big knowledge gap in the communities of people that are caregivers or maybe receiving palliative care at home and not often able or willing to reach out to their providers for resources. So I'm here to just make sure that education is in the communities, there's health equity in the communities, and that we really be mindful of the wellness piece of this. So in my business in consulting and wellness, I consult new nurses or anyone in the healthcare profession, but I believe there's a whole population of wellness nurses that is needed in the cannabis space. So I do consulting for nurses to enter that space, but also for the adult recreational user out there, it's cannabis wellness consulting, because I know that there are caregivers and others out there using cannabis that really could use some education.
Right, thank you. Yeah, so we are here to talk about cannabinoid-based medicine, CBM, and in the space of treating hospice and palliative care patients. While you were waiting, I'm not sure whether that slide came up, but there was a quote by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Dr. Kubler-Ross challenged the traditional clinical approach to death and dying and focused on helping patients and medical providers accept the inevitability of their passing with dignity and compassion. And she's best known for her book on death and dying, and with the 5 stages of grief that you'll find those 5 stages of grief applicable whether you're experiencing a personal loss of any kind. I know that I've used it for my own personal mental health, reflected upon it as well. I have a deep, strong personal connection to the hospice and palliative care movement, where it was my mother who introduced me to Dr. Kubler-Ross and her work. Ironically enough, or just the way that the universe works, this was a couple of decades before I lost my mom to cancer. Then I lost my sister to cancer, and I lost my dad to cancer and dementia. And hospice and palliative care, unfortunately, at that time, I did not have the scientific knowledge that I have now about cannabis and how it would have helped their death and the treatment while they were each facing with the particular symptoms that they had. So hospice movement and palliative care movement is a powerful one. And both of these hospice and palliative care have a team approach to treatment, which focuses on the emotional, spiritual needs of life, prioritizing comfort and quality of life by reducing pain and suffering. So let's get started. And to clarify, is hospice care is for patients who are facing they are dying, whereas a palliative care is focused on patients who have a life-shortening disease. So again, hospice, life-ending disease, and palliative simply is life-shortening disease. So Dr. Schneider, I'll kick off the questions with you. And how do you consider treatment for the symptoms that are associated with the hospice and palliative care patients? So most commonly, and I think that you would best speak to those, but nausea, vomiting, anxiety, and several more. So if you would address that first question.
I sure will. Yeah, absolutely. It's challenging, and I think that our participants can understand that it depends on where you are in the country, right? Or world, as in Dr. Pearson's case. So, the symptoms we see very often: pain, just like Jackie said, pain, nausea, anorexia, insomnia, anxiety, the existential suffering, right? That comes with the fact that, oh my gosh, I just got a cancer diagnosis, or I have I was just told I have ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. And I'm dealing with these things. I'm dealing with the loss of control. So really just having to figure out what symptom is in front of us and what are we hoping for, right? So what's our goal? Most of my patients do not want to be on opioids. They don't want to be on benzodiazepines. They don't like the side effects, the constipation, the sedation. Just sometimes, I hear a lot of, I don't want to be out of it. So I think, that's something that I see very frequently. And I'm hampered here in New York. And I really hope we do better with this, but I'm hampered because I don't have readily available COAs or certificates of analysis. I'm not sure what terpenes are in my products. I'm not sure. Really, sometimes I don't know what cultivar it is. So it's hard, and it's hard to dose those things. So yeah, I'm a little bit hampered, and I will say a lot of my patients go to the legacy market because of that. But those are the main symptoms that we're seeing.
Oh, thank you. And yeah, I was shocked when you and I had our previous discussions and about the COAs and that what's missing, and that we'll talk about that in a little bit. Dr. Pearson, how about you with the symptoms that you're treating your patients for, and how you're differentiating the care that you're providing for these patients versus your other medical cannabis patients?
Well, basically, like Jackie said, a lot of those same symptoms, if we're talking palliative or hospice, nausea, vomiting, pain, certainly the insomnia, which, although we're talking about hospice today, that is an outpatient side of the practice that I have. Those are a lot of the same symptoms that our outpatient patients have, right? With fibromyalgia or chronic pain related to osteoarthritis or degenerative disc disease, or our neuropathic pain. So although we're talking hospice, that symptom profile and what cannabinoids treat, or the symptoms that improve, are no different than in that outpatient setting. And what I really appreciate about cannabinoid-based medicine is that here we are talking nausea, pain, sleep. Well, we can use one class of medications as opposed to an Ambien or lorazepam at night, Zofran for the nausea, an SSRI for the anxiety, a tramadol for the pain. So it's not uncommon to reduce polypharmacy, or the number of drugs people are on, sometimes by 3 or 4, which is the big gold star for cannabinoid-based medicines for me.
Thank you. And Tony, your approach?
So I am more of a palliative in the setting and their families. And I always say this, I believe that we should be putting this education out and offering out like we do Motrin and Tylenol, right? In this cannabis medication, because that is what it's doing. We go back to the pain, the anxiety, and the insomnia. If your muscles hurt, they're going to say, go to the drugstore and get the Motrin. We should be able and have that in the communities and available to inpatients and outpatients. And again, the caregivers in this situation, because like Dr. Pearson said, these what the cannabinoids are treating are not exclusive to cancer patients. And if the entire family or caregiving circle were educated and can utilize the benefit, hey, it just may be a better outcome for everyone involved because of so much stigma behind it. But if it was more of integrated as the circle of care this is the plant medicine, it would be, I just think it would be a beautiful thing.
Those of us in the industry understand that well. And Dr. Pearson brought it up with the polypharmacy. One of the pharmaceutical products that's commonly used for treating patients that are suffering from these symptoms is dronabinol, marketed as Marinol. And it's an FDA drug. It was approved in 1985 to treat patients going through chemotherapy. So with those common symptoms of the nausea and vomiting. Dr. Schneider, with you have, I would say, probably far more limited practice with working within the VA. And so if you'd speak to your experience, were you seeing patients that are prescribed Marinol versus patients that are being treated with medical cannabis? So would you share what you see as a difference, and are you using Marinol?
For sure. So I can use Marinol in the VA, and I think the optimal word is can. And Tony and I both made faces very quickly when you brought up that the drug. The reason is because there's something to be said about true plant medicine versus synthetic. And this is a synthetic, formulation. It's made in a lab. And I do not find that my patients get benefits from it. They often tell me they have a paranoia type of heightened anxiety feeling when they take it. They do not get a lot of symptom relief from it. My own aunts have tried it. The aunt that I spoke to you about, recently, who had breast cancer, and, passed a year ago, she hated using Marinol, but using actual plant cannabis, homemade edibles, she was a different person, much happier, pain was controlled. So in my practice, if I see people on it, I often remove. That's just me. And, clearly I have no kickbacks from that drug company. 'Cause we're not friends.
Tony, if you would address the face that you made.
Well, I agree. I just believe the plant in itself doesn't need help to heal. That's wake up. You can cover it up as long as you want, but the truth of the matter is the plant is medicine, and let's deep dive into the cannabinoids, open up education, get health equity in line, and let's all live a good life on nature. That's how I really feel. It's the medicine of now. There's a shift, and traditional medicine, I believe, like when things begin to shift, you try to find a way to, how can I stay in it? Just relax into it, keep the medicine over there, and let us have this plant and have it be an offering. Let people have the option. I don't believe in a cancellation of traditional medicine. I just don't believe that it should be the first go-to. And I think that if we are able to get there where we are able to offer the plant as the first go-to, we know it will be the go-to, but we have to get there first. So that's how I truly think about that.
Yeah. Dr. Pearson, would you speak to your experience with Marinol?
Sure. So here in Canada, we don't actually have it. We have, woo.
And why? I mean, that's
yeah.
why not?
So it's just like more of a logistics thing. So we have basically another version called, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Nabalone. If any of you guys have heard of it.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have Nabalone, and same idea, a synthetic THC. And I was making similar faces because in practice, it really is inferior to the whole plant extract. And that's just the truth from an efficacy standpoint. And also from a side effect standpoint. Anytime you isolate a compound, strip it, in this case of the terpenes, CBD, the other cannabinoids, I find people don't tolerate Nabalone in this case, as well as our whole plant extracts. So why we will use it, and this is an issue that I'm fighting against for coverage for the whole plant extracts, flower, soft gels from the extracts, is for coverage. So sometimes we're handcuffed because Nabalone, if I'm using it for chemotherapy-induced nausea, vomiting, or on the long-term care side that to manage behaviors, it's covered for a lot of patients. So sometimes cost can be an issue, and we'll default to a Nabalone or a Marinol just because of that reason.
Yeah, I mean, and along those lines is, I was talking with a social worker who was concerned about her patient were testing positive. She's a medical cannabis patient, and that considering having a healthcare provider prescribe her Marinol, so that if she would pop positive for THC, that that the social worker would be able to, or the patient would be able to say, I have this prescription for Marinol. Dr. Schneider, would you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, that is a common reason why people will call me and ask for medical cards too, right? It's, oh my goodness, I'm going to have this in my system, and it's not, and certainly in the federal system, right, where I work, Marinol would be acceptable. Whereas any plant-based, extract, flower, anything is not acceptable, right? Because it's still considered a Schedule I drug. So, and card carrying or not, that doesn't fly in the federal system because cards are state. So it's difficult, and for sure, a lot of people, are concerned. We had a very large tragedy here in Buffalo in May, and it is not without, surprise that a lot of police officers are calling me and saying, hey, I'm having this issue. I have anxiety. I have PTSD over what I saw. And it's tough because everyone's concerned about the urine drug screen.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what's so, frustrating at the federal level in the US is that, whether it's the illicit market or the legal market, we're now the majority of the country, or all of the country, if we're talking about the illicit market, has access to the plant. I personally have who better to take care of your fireplace than a fireman. And he shared with me every time he comes into my house and is working on the fireplace and suffers from tremendous headache, migraines. And that the medicine that he's using, he says, knocks him out for a day. And but he knows that if he tests positive for THC, there goes that opportunity, there goes his job. And he well understands. So it's really unfortunate, the limitations that we have with the federal government, and particularly in the US. Dr. Pearson, so yeah, that great segue into the Canadian model. So if you would briefly explain that, is cannabis or medical cannabis covered by insurance, and you have the public insurance, Health Canada, and then private insurance. And if you explain, please, what's covered, what's not.
Yeah, I'll jump right into that. I just wanted to make a comment too on just kind of the double standards that are out there, even though it's legal here federally. Employers, like some of these big, in my neck of the woods, there's a lot of oil and gas companies, safety sensitive jobs, and they just put the restrictions on these workers. This guy just wants to take 5 milligrams of THC at night to sleep. They allowed him to take Ambien, they allowed him to take lorazepam, and when he was honest with them, with his medical prescription, they took him off specific duties. He lost $50,000. They referred him to a psychiatrist at Calgary to have an independent medical exam to see if he was fit for duty, all because of a 5 milligram THC at night prescription. So we have our issues over here still too. But anyways, that was just kind of a aside. But as far as coverage goes, something I'm really passionate about, because I see the benefits for my kiddos with autism, for my patients with dementia, the kids with epilepsy. And unfortunately, no, there's no coverage, federal coverage or provincial. So no state or Medicaid or Medicare coverage, nothing like that. What we do have is at least some private insurers now are starting to cover it. I'd like to tell you for a number of indications, but at the moment, certainly with our topic today, if you have private insurance, there is coverage for chemotherapy-induced nausea, vomiting, end-of-life distress, and anything related to MS spasticity is covered. But other than that, it's pretty limited, the coverage. So small amount of coverage for a small amount of diagnoses, but hopefully that changes with all the good work everybody's doing here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Moving on to a question about delivery methods. So getting to the specifics of treating the hospice and palliative care patients with medical cannabis. So Tony, if you would, Dr. Pearson.
I left something out that Nikki
Yes.
in the chat pointed out. Full coverage, and Jackie, you'll appreciate this, for the vets. So if you're a veteran and you served or for Canada, 3 grams a day is covered, no questions.
Yeah, and a model, is states, if I jump in for Tony answering that question, for the coverage that the veterans are getting, certainly, and Dr. Schneider will speak to that, where she cannot recommend medical cannabis to her VA patients. But in Missouri, yesterday passed, was the 21st state to pass adult use. Maryland, yay, Maryland, home state here, pass adult use. But one of the initiatives that was included in Missouri's, the new regs for adult use is setting up funds to care for veterans. So that's a state program. So that's a wonderful example. I hope Maryland follows suit.
Yes.
Anybody in the chat would love to share if you know of other states that are already focusing on the veterans. And in light of Veterans Day is tomorrow in the US. So please share in the chat. So moving on from that to delivery methods for the patient population we're talking about.
Yeah, so I always start, there's such a stigma out there and there's such a knowledge gap. So I really like to enter slow and listen. Let me hear your stance on the plant first, and then we can start. And usually what I find, my population are more Gen Xers and boomers, that there's a conversation about the stigma removal. So we begin with topicals. All right, give you something topical for pain. And then if you need something for sleep or an anxiety, I start very low, probably a gummy like, and we don't have dosing like Canada does. So I always start very low, like at 0.2 and then 5 and then 10, progress slowly, but we build up over return consultation and documentation, because it's important to really document your journey, because it's not a one size fits all. And you will find that tolerance builds up over time. So if you can look back and see where you were and document those, assess yourself is what I believe in and what we do during consultation. So I always like to start low and slow, topical first. And then when it comes to inhalation, there's a stigma around the flower, but there's an essence of the flower. So I do tend to lean flower versus vape, and old schoolers can appreciate the flower sometime, but the secrecy of the vape comforts them. So there's a balance there.
Right, thank you. Dr. Schneider, how do you treat your patients?
Yeah, so it depends on what their symptoms are, right? So if I have a cancer patient, for example, who is suffering from nausea, they're not going to touch your latest and greatest, gummy on the market, or whatever, some cookie that came from somewhere. Why? Because some of them have no appetite there, and it just like that sugar, that gelatin, it just makes people sick. So oftentimes I will go to either, depends on what's in my dispensaries, right? So the trouble again in New York, we don't have a ton of medical dispensaries. You have to drive. If you're in rural New York, good luck. You're going 2 hours away plus. So maybe I have a capsule at my disposal, perhaps tincture. Also too, sometimes with that tincture, that taste, that like herbal medicine taste, people just cannot tolerate. So I do the same thing as Tony. I always start, low and go slow into that. Tony made me laugh because my father-in-law, the only way I got him to touch anything with cannabis was with topicals. And now calls constantly for his, refill. He needs his topical because that's the only thing that manages his arthritis. But anyways, yeah, so it really depends on what's close to my patients, and what their symptoms are. Some of them will vape whole flower, right? They'll take it into a vaporizer, not necessarily combusting it, but it really just depends on what I have. I saw Nikki's in the chat. Nikki Lawley is a very good friend of mine and a patient advocate across the country for medical cannabis, but we both looked at flower that came from an unknown dispensary in New York that is a medical dispensary, and it was of yellow brownish tinge of some sorts. I don't know what it was, but it was not something that I would ever have one of my medical patients take. So yeah, it's really just what do I have? And I hope that we'll have more access like they do in Canada, where I can actually say, okay, this capsule at this lowest dose, 2 to 3 times a day, depending on what your symptoms are. Maybe CBD during the day and a more THC heavy at night might make more sense, but I'm struggling with what I got on the supply shelves.
unfortunate stories. Dr. Pearson, how about the availability of products and how you start your patients?
Yeah, so it is nice to have consistent sources that are checked, regulated, you know what you're getting every time. That certainly has helped me in my education too of other physicians and a lot of the teaching I do, because that's certainly a key piece for adoptions, because we all know still Canada and the US, there are not a lot of nurses and docs comfortable with cannabinoid medicine. So that's something that helps. And for me, I'll do exactly what Jackie said there, like start most folks a CBD dominant, usually an oil to start for me, because I like, whether I'm using CBD or THC, I like using the liquid to titrate. It's easier to titrate. Some of the capsules or gummies are just set doses like 10, 20, but with the oils, we can really titrate low and slow, similar what Tony was talking about as well. Basically, all of us, same idea, right? Low and slow to start. So for me, an oil, if they can't tolerate the taste because of that plant medicine feel for some people, we'll switch them to a capsule once they're at their therapeutic dose. That's not uncommon. So a lot of oils, capsules, a lot of vaporized dried flower for our breakthrough pain, our acute nausea. When you need relief immediately, they'll vaporize it, a lot of the patients. And just like Tony said as well, topicals, those just in the last 2 years have been on the shelves here. We kind of call it like 2.0. Some of the products came out, even though they've been out for years and years. But now that I've used the topicals in practice, that is certainly a nice, just a nice other modality that, from what I'm seeing, a lot of patients are finding the topicals really helpful as well.
That's great to hear. And considering, so each one of you has spoken about the edibles and gummies. And so let's address that, the consideration of polypharmacy, so that with the challenges of edibles and that competing during metabolism in the liver with CYP450. And Jackie, I'll start with you. You're the first one to bring up edibles. And how do you address polypharmacy?
Yeah, well, there's two things, right? So I have to look at their long medication list, and then, what chemotherapy are they on? What immunotherapy are they on, right? Because there's a whole lot of stuff that goes into that too. The newest immune checkpoint inhibitors for cancer patients. So I have to look to see, A, are there going to be any drug interactions? And then B, can I knock out half of these meds, right? So that's what, Dr. Pearson was talking about, is we're, and especially in my line of work with palliative care patients, we're throwing meds left and right at people to try to combat all these symptoms. And oftentimes cannabis will target all of them, right? So if I'm throwing out like a mirtazapine for sleep and anorexia, and then I'm giving someone methadone for their pain, but I also have to give them, an as needed. So therefore I'm giving them hydromorphone or oxycodone. All those things can be oftentimes potentially not eliminated depending on how severe, the symptoms are, but certainly cut back. So there's two issues, can we knock down some of these, the med lists? And patients are just so lost. They got their med box and it's filled with hundreds of pills. And, they come to me and they say, I need the blue one. And I'm like, I don't know what the blue one is, and it's expensive. So, their copays, so we can knock those down. But also we have to be really careful about drug interactions, any types of, warfarin, anti-epileptics. Definitely, I got to watch, depending on the oncologic agents that they're using. But, doesn't mean they can't. It just means we have to be a little bit more careful.
Mm-hmm. Tony, if you would address some polypharmacy with the patients that you see, and the use of, polypharmacy number one, and then consideration of the use of edibles.
Yes, I have to echo everything Dr. Jacqueline said. I mean, verbatim, and also add, that is something I'm really mindful of, and that's a partnership with that oncologist, that patient, and I. there's a conversation that needs to take place. There's recommendations from both sides that need to be made. I really don't navigate without the oncologist input, because that's just, you want to be mindfully palliative. You don't want to cause any unnecessary harm, right? And the goal is ultimately to have a true palliative experience and begin to wean from some of those antiemetics and pain reducers. So I work closely with the oncologist, unless you have a person who's out there and they're already in that natural palliative state. So that's when you're going to need a little bit more from the topicals into the edibles. And that's a conversation, and that's going back to that journaling and documentation to see when is a good time to introduce an edible. And back to Dr. Pearson, the tinctures, sometimes they work, but when you're feeling a lot of nausea, it could turn bad really quick. So really, again, a partnership with all three of us, and being mindful of how we navigate the plan.
Yeah, and so you're leading into a great question. Thank you for that. With so with hospice and palliative care being renowned as a team approach to care, and so to Dr. Pearson, where how receptive are your colleagues for speaking to an oncologist and the other specialists that are part of that treatment care plan? So you coming in as the medical cannabis expert, how receptive are your medical peers?
Luckily for me and where I'm located, and doing this for a number of years, it's fairly collegial, and it certainly wasn't that case out of the gate. That working across neurology, oncology, the hospice team wasn't as good as it is now. Very clunky, a lot of misconceptions. But now after, and this is true, like basically anywhere you go, and once you start practicing, you'll have a lot of resistance. And then once the team, because it's physicians, the nurses, you'll get resistance across the board, front desk staff. Once everyone sees the results and how you're caring for the patients, then all of that goes away. But there's certainly some stigma and bias to overcome in any new long-term care home I work in or hospice. And then after a few patients, it runs smooth. So to answer the question now, quite well. Collaborative approach with the palliative care team, with the oncology team. We're sending our consult notes back and forth, and everyone's on the same page, which is nice.
What do you attribute this to? That we're in the US, there's still the ongoing battle and stigma. And so with us, it's that it's federally legal. And is it education? Are healthcare providers required to can't have cannabis education, cannabis CMEs? I mean, what do you attribute?
Literally, not to toot my own horn, but the hard work over the few years of treating the patients and seeing it, because it isn't required. So it's not, if you go to, I don't know, another state or province, it's not, won't necessarily be like that, because it isn't required. The cannabinoid medicine education I do is usually for keen nurses and docs, but there's no requirements, except for, here's a positive note, the pharmacy training now in Canada, at least. If you need to renew your pharmacist license, you have to complete a cannabinoid medicine module. So at least pharmacy is trending in the right direction.
Hats off to Canada yet again. Yeah, Tony, you and I had spoken about with your approach in the community, and what you are doing to remove stigma, educate your colleagues in the healthcare space about the plant-based medicine.
Yeah, I think community education is at the root of all this, because again, I will say it again soon, this will be Tylenol and Motrin out there, and not prescribed properly can lead to many problems. So this week we're closing down. We're having I live in Oakland, California, and we're throwing an Equity Week event. And what we're doing is highlighting equity cannabis dispensaries in the communities. There's 5 different dispensaries that are participating. But along with that, there's education. The bud tenders are getting education, and I'm working to get, going back to first responders, going to get nurses and firefighters and police officers at least educated and comfortable, because like Dr. Jacqueline said earlier, we need this for the stress and the PTSD. I am a burnout nurse, as I said at the top of the conversation, and is what has helped me. So I do a lot of that, educating the nurses and doctors and firefighters to hopefully get them comfortable to at least start using the CBD until we can work around policies to eliminate that urine test and that, which is ridiculous here. So yeah, really education, education, and more education.
100%. And that's why we're here today. And that's what Cannabis MD is all about. Dr. Schneider, shifting gears a little bit and going in with tomorrow, recognizing that it is Veterans Day here in the US. So with your practice, where you shared with me what happens when a VA patient shares that they are using medical cannabis.
Yes. And yes, tomorrow is Veterans Day, and I would not be the physician I am without being able to treat the veterans that I do, and I'm forever grateful. However, if they do share that they use cannabis, or it pops up on a urine drug screen because perhaps they are on opioids or another controlled substance, we have in our charts a problem list, which is, basically where all of the diagnoses go. And so they will have cannabis use disorder or substance use disorder, whichever one the provider picks at that time, put into their chart. And the tough part is that carries through for, sometimes it just is there forever and doesn't drop off. And certainly I'm unsure that they're going through the DSM-5 criteria to really see if there's true cannabis use disorder, or what that is. I still am unsure.
Yeah, and it is confusing, the DSM. And Dr. Pearson or Tony, do you have anything to weigh in about with the DSM and cannabis use disorder, CUD, what you see, challenges that you have with other providers? Anything, Dad?
I'm in the community base mostly, so I don't really have that kind of contact.
Dr. Pearson?
For me, it's certainly, I would just say, regardless of what the DSM says, my own take on it is just that it can be an issue. Like I've seen cannabis use disorder. It's not as common as the psychiatrists think, because literally, if you tell a psychiatrist, no offense if anybody's psychiatry joining us, but if you mention cannabis, you'll see that in the diagnosis, cannabis use disorder, and it's a cop out. There's more going on with these patients than all their issues are related to their cannabis use. Having said that, it can be a problem. So when is it a problem? If we're not talking about actually treating a condition, we're not talking palliative or hospice or the patient with neuropathic pain, we're talking about, now that it's legal here in Canada, and let's say it's a 23-year-old person and they're smoking cannabis all day, and it's the only thing they want to do. They've kind of withdrawn from social circles. They're not functioning well at school or in their job, and where it's negatively impacting their life, then yeah, that's an issue, and that needs to be addressed. So it's certainly a diagnosis, but to me, that's really the main pillars of, is it negatively affecting your life? Are you withdrawn socially? Those are the big things for me.
Dr. Schneider, do you have some information to add on identifying cannabis use disorder, CUD?
Yeah, I totally agree with Dr. Pearson. But there's never let's talk about how it, are you stealing from your family to pay for your cannabis? Are you not waking up and going to your job? How long has this been going on for? Because the DSM also includes, that it's been for a period of within 12 months. those questions aren't asked. It's you use cannabis, therefore you must have cannabis use disorder. And that is not true, right? So that's often, if you ask any of our, the patients who are taking cannabis, it's often for anxiety, PTSD. I mean, my vets have seen horrific things, through the years. And some of them, have been in treatment facilities for PTSD, in which the VA has amazing treatment facilities. But, if a vet admits to that, it's tough now, right? So that goes in the chart. And then, what if they break their leg or they have have an appendicitis and they need to get opioids? We're going to look at twice and say, there's a substance use disorder tag in the chart. Like, what happened here? And it may not be because they're engaging in those negative, acts, those things that exactly like Dr. Pearson said, like they're withdrawing, they're, not going to school. But that's often not what happens. It's just boom, that, you're using, therefore you must.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. And I do want to predicate this with is that medical cannabis, I say it's not a panacea. It is not for everybody. And that everybody needs to be mindful of its use. So we do have a question that to circle back to the question, or I'm sorry, to the comment and information shared with us, Dr. Pearson, about the pharmacists being required. So if you would provide some more information on that.
Oh, sure. So if they're renewing their license, then they have to complete, it's a special module that was created by the Ontario College of Pharmacists, but it's a specific module in cannabinoid medicine, or you can't renew the license. So it's mandatory, and that is great news.
Yeah. And then I was curious and wonder about the lobbying efforts of the different medical societies, associations against having to take a continuing medical education course on cannabinoid medicine, because it's, we're talking about polypharmacy, the effects, the challenges of the different medications that folks are on, and particularly the patient demographic that we're talking about. Well, I would think that wraps up. We're at just about top of the hour 4 for this conversation, which has just been fantastic. And wanted to see, Emily, do we have, I've had the chat off, so I'm staying focused. Anything to add that you see with questions, last questions to ask?
We have a lot of comments of everyone appreciating this conversation.
Excellent.
Yeah, we're amongst friends here, so
Yes, yeah.
great.
Yeah, one that we didn't really get to specifically is that Dr. Pearson in Canada, so there are dosing guidelines, which we do, there are not here in the US. So if you could briefly speak to the dosing guidelines or clarify what
it's not like it's a accepted thing, let's say, by the Canadian Medical Association, but there are some papers out there, and believe it's Caroline McCallum's and Ethan Russo's latest one, or it's a couple years old, but that's really the dosing guidelines that a lot of clinicians in Canada will follow, and it's very straightforward, and it's likely the same that Jackie and Tony are following, in that low and slow, they put some numbers to it. So 2.5 milligrams THC, titrate every 3 or 4 days. And for CBD, a little bit more wiggle room because it's better tolerated. 5 milligrams starting, and titrate every 3 or 4 days, which is obviously very conservative for CBD. So some folks will follow those guidelines, or maybe start at 10 or 20 milligrams for CBD.
Right. Yeah. And what we'll do is, I'm very familiar with the paper that you're speaking about. So I'll go ahead and send a link to everybody who's registered for the webinar so that they can get that paper firsthand. So Dr. Schneider, thank you for taking the time to join us today. And thank you for what you're doing, taking care of our veterans. My dad went through medical school on the VA bill. And so I'm grateful for every veteran on the, whether it's in the US or Canada, that have have given their time and their service.
And
Tony,
we're
thank you so
celebrating
much.
them tomorrow too. It's our
Oh, are you? Okay.
Yeah, we call it Remembrance Day here, but same day. And
Yes, that's right.
yeah.
Yeah. Canada, you do a lot of things right. Tony, thank you for joining us from California and your perspective with the community. And again, Dr. Pearson, thank you for taking the time to join us as well from Canada.